Log entry, day 28. It's not smoke I'm looking for anymore. It's them. For 3 weeks, I listened to that sound, praying it would stop. But now it has. The sound just stopped, and that's worse. Let's go back 4 weeks earlier. The road to the Two Forks Lookout wasn't a road so much as a scar. It was a gravel track carved into the side of the mountain, clinging to the granite cliffs with what felt like sheer, stubborn arrogance. The Forest Service pickup truck groaned and shuddered with every switchback, its tires spitting stones into the 1,000-foot drop that yawned just outside my passenger side window. I kept my eyes fixed forward, focusing on the impenetrable wall of pine and fear that lined the inside of the path. Driving the truck was a man named Howard, a district ranger whose face seemed to be carved from the same timber as the forest around us. His skin was a roadmap of wrinkles, his knuckles were thick and calloused, and his eyes, buried in deep sockets, held the flat, patient look of a man who had seen 1,000 seasons come and go. "Almost there," he grunted, wrenching the wheel to navigate a particularly nasty curve. "Another mile and we hit the trailhead. You walk the last half mile. Supply mule can't even make it all the way up. Too steep." I just nodded, my throat too tight to form words. It was exactly what I'd wanted. Remote. Inaccessible. A place where the world couldn't follow. "You're Alex, right?" he asked, not taking his eyes off the trail. "Yes, sir." "No sir out here, son. Just the mountain. You treat her with respect. She'll let you stay. You don't, well." He let the sentence hang in the air, thick and heavy as the scent of pine pitch. He glanced over at me, his gaze lingering on my face for a moment longer than was comfortable. "You're young for this gig. Most of the lookouts we get are old-timers looking to get away from a talkative wife or college kids thinking it's a paid vacation. You don't look like either." "Just needed a change of scenery," I said, the lie tasting like ash in my mouth. I wasn't here for the scenery. I was here for the silence, for the penance. Howard seemed to accept this, or at least he didn't press it. "Fair enough. You'll get plenty of scenery up there, more than you know what to do with." Howard shrugged, his eyes scanning the trees. "Wind plays tricks up there, makes the steel frame sing. You'll get used to it, or you won't." He clapped me on the shoulder, a gesture that was probably meant to be reassuring, but felt more like a final judgment. "Radio in every morning at 0800 and again at 1800. If you see smoke, you call it in, day or night. Don't matter if it's a lightning strike or some idiot's campfire. You're the eye in the sky, Alex. Only eye for 3 whole counties. Don't forget that." He gave me a final, measuring look, then climbed back into his truck. "I'll be back for you October 1st. Try not to go crazy before then." The truck rumbled away, and soon the sound was swallowed by the immense silence of the forest. I stood there for a long time, the keys cold and heavy in my hand. Then I shouldered my pack, took a deep breath of the clean, sharp air, and began the final ascent to my new home. My prison, my perch. The climb was grueling, a near-vertical scramble over roots and rocks. By the time I reached the base of the tower, my lungs were burning and my legs felt like jelly. It stood on a small, circular patch of cleared granite, the ground falling away steeply on all sides, and it was immense. 100 feet of skeletal, rust-colored steel crisscrossing its way into the sky. At the very top, a tiny 14 by 14-foot room sat like a glass crown. The journey up the 133 steps of the external staircase was a trial of its own. The wind, which had been a gentle breeze on the forest floor, was a physical force up here, tugging at my clothes and trying to pry my fingers from the cold steel railing. With every step, the world expanded. The trees fell away, replaced by a breathtaking, terrifying panorama of green and blue. I felt like an ant climbing a blade of grass. The cab was exactly as Howard had described it. A small, square room with glass windows on all 4 sides. In the center stood the Osborne Firefinder, a brass and steel disc of maps and sighting mechanisms that looked like some kind of arcane navigational tool. A small cot was folded against one wall, a wooden desk and chair against another. Plenty of silence, too. He slowed the truck to a crawl as we entered a small, sun-dappled clearing. Here we are, end of the line. He killed the engine, and the sudden quiet was a physical thing, pressing in on my ears. It wasn't the quiet of a library. It was an ancient, living silence, woven from the sigh of the wind through a million needles and the distant cry of a hawk. We unloaded my pack and a few boxes of supplies. Howard handed me a heavy ring of keys. That big brass one's for the ground level gate, the steel one's for the cab. Don't lose them. You lock yourself out up there, you're in for a bad time. He pointed up, and I followed his finger, craning my neck back until my spine cracked. I couldn't see it at first. The canopy was too dense. Then I caught it. A dark speck against the brilliant blue sky, a tiny man-made flaw in the perfect wilderness. She's been up there since the 30s, Howard said, a note of something, pride, maybe, or grim affection in his voice. One of the last original steel towers in the state, we call her the Devil's Perch, sits right on the highest point for 100 miles. When the wind really gets going, you'll know why. My heart hammered against my ribs. The Devil's Perch. It was perfect. The last guy, Howard continued, his voice dropping a little, he didn't finish the season, left 3 weeks early, said the solitude was getting to him, said he kept hearing things. Hearing things? I asked, my voice a little hoarse. Howard shrugged, his eyes scanning the trees. Wind plays tricks up there, makes the steel frame sing. You'll get used to it, or you won't. He clapped me on the shoulder, a gesture that was probably meant to be reassuring, but felt more like a final judgment. Radio in every morning at 0800, and again at 1800. If you see smoke, you call it in, day or night. Don't matter if it's a lightning strike or some idiot's campfire. You're the eye in the sky, Alex. Only eye for 3 whole counties. Don't forget that. He gave me a final, measuring look, then climbed back into his truck. I'll be back for you October 1st. Try not to go crazy before then. The truck rumbled away, and soon the sound was swallowed by the immense silence of the forest. I stood there for a long time, the keys cold and heavy in my hand. Then I shouldered my pack, took a deep breath of the clean, sharp air, and began the final ascent to my new home. My prison. My perch. The climb was grueling, a near vertical scramble over roots and rocks. By the time I reached the base of the tower, my lungs were burning and my legs felt like jelly. It stood on a small circular patch of cleared granite, the ground falling away steeply on all sides. And it was immense. 100 feet of skeletal, rust-colored steel crisscrossing its way into the sky. At the very top, a tiny 14 by 14-foot room sat like a glass crown. The journey up the 133 steps of the external staircase was a trial of its own. The wind, which had been a gentle breeze on the forest floor, was a physical force up here, tugging at my clothes and trying to pry my fingers from the cold steel railing. With every step, the world expanded. The trees fell away, replaced by a breathtaking, terrifying panorama of green and blue. I felt like an ant climbing a blade of grass. The cab was exactly as Howard had described it. A small, square room with glass windows on all 4 sides. In the center stood the Osborne Firefinder, a brass and steel disc of maps and sighting mechanisms that looked like some kind of arcane navigational tool. A small cot was folded against one wall, a wooden desk and chair against another. A propane stove, a small cupboard, and a trapdoor in the floor leading to a small catwalk below completed the furnishings. It was Spartan, functional, and utterly, completely isolated. I dropped my pack and walked a slow circle around the room, placing my hands on the cool glass. The view was staggering. A rolling, endless sea of green, stretching to every horizon, broken only by the distant, hazy blue of other mountain ranges. There was not a single sign of human civilization in any direction. No roads, no houses, no power lines. Nothing. For the first time in a year, I felt a flicker of something that wasn't guilt or grief. It wasn't peace, not yet. But it was a start. Here there was nothing to remind me of the world I had ruined. Nothing to remind me of the smell of smoke, the sound of sirens, the sight of my parents' faces crumbling. Nothing to remind me of Chloe. My sister's face flashed in my mind, her bright, laughing eyes. I squeezed my own eyes shut, pushing the memory down. This is for you, Chloe, I thought, my throat constricting. 100 days of silence. It's the least I can do. The first week passed in a haze of routine. I learned the rhythms of the tower, the language of the mountain. Mornings were for weather reports and radio check-ins. The afternoons were for long, slow sweeps of the horizon with the binoculars, my eyes tracing the contours of the vast landscape. I learned to tell the difference between the shadow of a cloud and the darker patch of a denser forest. I learned the names of the peaks and valleys from the worn maps tacked to the wall. Cougar Ridge, Widow's Creek, Black Iron Mountain. The silence was a constant companion. At first, it was unnerving. I'd find myself talking aloud just to hear a voice. But slowly, I settled into it. The silence became a balm, a thick, heavy blanket that smothered the screaming in my head. The wind was my only real company, a ceaseless whisper that sometimes rose to a mournful howl. Howard was right. It made the steel frame of the tower sing, a low, resonant hum that vibrated through the floors into my bones and up into. I got used to it. I did my best to keep my mind occupied. I read the tattered paperbacks left by previous lookouts. I meticulously maintained the logbook, noting wind speed, humidity, and cloud cover with a detached, clinical precision. I tried not to think about the fire, about the space heater I'd left too close to the curtains in the guest room, about waking up to the smell of smoke and my father's shouting, about the firefighters holding me back as the flames consumed the second floor where Chloe's bedroom was. Here, on top of the world, those thoughts had less power. The guilt was still there, a cold, heavy stone in my gut, but the sheer scale of the wilderness made it feel small. My personal tragedy felt insignificant against the backdrop of geological time. It was on the 9th day that the weather turned. The morning sky, usually a brilliant cloudless azure, was a bruised, yellowish gray. The air grew thick and heavy, charged with a strange electricity. My 0800 radio call came with a warning. "Big storm cell moving in from the west, Alex," Howard's voice crackled. "Looks like a bad one. Should hit you around midday. Just batten down the hatches and ride it out. Don't touch any metal during the lightning." He wasn't wrong. By noon, the sky was the color of lead. The wind, my constant companion, rose from a howl to a visceral, physical shriek. The first drops of rain hit the glass like pebbles, and within minutes, the world outside the cab dissolved into a churning gray vortex. The tower began to sway, a sickening, rhythmic motion, groaning and creaking like a ship in a storm. Then the lightning started. It wasn't the distant flashes I was used to, it was all around me. Blinding, white-hot fissures would tear open the sky, followed almost instantly by a concussive blast of thunder that shook the tower to its foundations. I sat on the floor in the center of the room, away from the windows and the metal frame, my arms wrapped around my knees, feeling like a terrified god trapped at the heart of creation. The storm raged for hours, a relentless assault of wind, rain, and thunder. I was beginning to feel a strange, detached numbness when I heard it. It was a sound that didn't belong. Over the shriek of the wind, through the percussive slam of the thunder, it came, a low, deep, resonant tone. Bong. It was heavy, metallic, the sound of a massive bell, the kind you'd find in an old church steeple or a clock tower. It wasn't the sharp crack of lightning or the groan of steel. It was a clear, sustained, musical note that cut through the chaos of the storm and seemed to vibrate in my teeth. It came from somewhere out there in the gray, swirling void. Somewhere below me. My head snapped up. My rational mind scrambled for an explanation. It was the wind. It had to be the wind, hitting a steel beam at just the right angle to create a harmonic. Or it was a freak echo of thunder, bouncing off the mountainside in a bizarre way. It had to be something logical. I crawled to the desk and fumbled with the maps, my hands shaking. I scanned the area, my finger tracing the contour lines. Nothing. There was nothing out there. The nearest town was 70 miles away. No churches, no clock towers, just trees and rock. I pulled out an older, more detailed topographical map from a dusty drawer. On it, nestled deep in the valley to the northeast, was a small hand-drawn cross labeled St. Jude's Mission ruins. Beside it, a note in faded ink, "Bell Tower collapsed c. 1930. Impossible. It was impossible. I told myself I'd imagined it. A trick of the mind brought on by stress, fear, and the disorienting roar of the storm. An auditory hallucination. I clung to that explanation like a lifeline. The storm eventually blew itself out, leaving a world washed clean and silent in its wake. The sun broke through, setting the damp forest ablaze with sparkling light. I forced myself to forget the sound, burying it under the mundane tasks of my routine. I noted the rainfall in the logbook, checked the tower for damage, and made my 1800 radio call, reporting that all was well. 2 days later, the sky was a perfect, painless blue. The memory of the storm and the sound had begun to fade. I was on the catwalk, the 100-foot drop, a familiar, comfortable presence below me, scanning the horizon with my binoculars. I swept them from north to south, a slow, methodical arc. My gaze passed over Widow's Creek, across the scarred flank of Black Iron Mountain, and then down into the deep, thickly wooded valley to the northeast where the old mission was supposed to be. I wasn't looking for anything in particular, just doing my job. But then I stopped. Something had caught my eye, a flicker of movement where there should be none. It wasn't the swaying of trees or the flight of a bird. It was different. I raised the binoculars again, zeroing in on a small rocky outcrop that overlooked the densest part of the valley floor. I twisted the focus dial, my knuckles turning white as I gripped the metal housing. The image swam and then snapped into sharp relief. For a moment, I saw nothing but trees and rock. I was about to lower the binoculars to dismiss it as a trick of the light when I saw it again. It wasn't much, just a patch of something pale. A pale, vertical shape, standing half hidden behind the trunk of a massive Douglas fir. It was utterly still. Not the stillness of a rock, but the rigid, intentional stillness of something that was waiting, something that was watching. My breath caught in my chest. I stared, my eyes burning, trying to make out a shape, a form, a person. But it was too far. The shadows too deep. As I watched, the patch of pale color seemed to retreat, melting back into the darkness of the trees until it was gone completely. I stood there for a long time, the binoculars cold against my face. The sun was warm on my back, the air was still, and the birds were singing their evening songs. But the peace of the Devil's Perch was gone, shattered. In its place, a cold, sharp dread was beginning to take root. The impossible sound of the bell in the storm, and now this, a pale shape in the woods. I was no longer alone on the mountain, and a single terrifying question echoed in the vast empty silence of my mind. What's in the valley? Understood. The dread will now begin to tighten its grip. Sleep did not come easily that night. Every gust of wind scraping a branch against the tower's steel legs sounded like footsteps on the stairs. The normal, comforting groan of the structure felt like the growl of a waking beast. I kept the small propane lantern burning, its gentle hiss a fragile shield against the oppressive, ink-black darkness that pressed in on the glass from all sides. My binoculars sat on the desk beside my cot, and more than once I found myself reaching for them, fighting the urge to sweep the black void of the valley for that flicker of pale cloth. But I knew it was useless. Out there in that sea of darkness, I was the only source of light for 100 miles. A tiny, illuminated cage suspended in the sky. If something was watching, it could see me, but I could never see it. The thought was a cold knot in my stomach. The next morning, I was up before the sun, my eyes gritty with exhaustion. A thick blanket of mist filled the valleys, making the peaks of the surrounding mountains look like islands in a silver ocean. I made coffee, my hands trembling slightly, and forced myself into a state of professional calm. There had to be a logical explanation. A poacher, maybe, or a hermit. Someone living off-grid who didn't want to be found. The pale shape was probably just a tarp covering their camp. It was a flimsy theory, but it was better than the alternative, which my mind refused to properly articulate. Using the firefinder, I took a precise bearing on the rocky outcrop where I'd seen the movement. I cross-referenced it with the old topographical map. The location was exact. Dead center of the area marked St. Jude's Mission, ruins. Whatever I had seen was there. For the next 3 days, I became obsessed. My world, once a 360-degree panorama, shrank to that one small patch of forest. I spent hours with the binoculars pressed to my eyes, scanning the outcrop, the surrounding trees, the deep shadows on the valley floor. I watched until my vision blurred and the landscape seemed to pulse with a life of its own. I saw nothing, not a flicker of movement, not a wisp of smoke from a campfire, not a single sign that anyone or anything was down there. The silence was absolute, broken only by the wind and the occasional cry of an eagle. The bell remained quiet. With each passing, uneventful hour, my fear began to feel foolish. I was a city kid, spooked by shadows. The bell had been the storm. The figure had been a trick of the light, a patch of pale fungus on a tree trunk, or maybe a sun-bleached animal skull. Howard's words echoed in my mind. The solitude was getting to him. Said he kept hearing things. Waste that what was happening to me? Was the crushing weight of the isolation, compounded by the guilt I carried, starting to crack my sanity? The thought was more terrifying than any phantom in the woods. I made a conscious effort to break the obsession. I forced myself to read, to clean the cab until it gleamed, to do push-ups and sit-ups on the small patch of open floor until I was gasping with exhaustion. I radioed in my morning and evening reports with a forced, cheerful confidence in my voice, as if trying to convince myself as much as Howard. On the fourth night after the sighting, day 14 of my stay, I finally felt a semblance of peace return. The day had been warm and clear. The keep your head on straight, it's a lonely place. After the call, I knew I couldn't ignore it any longer. This wasn't in my head. I tore the cab apart, searching for answers. The men and women who had manned this post before me, they must have seen something, heard something. In a small locked footlocker under the cot, I found them. A stack of leather-bound logbooks, their pages yellowed and brittle with age, dating all the way back to the 1940s. I spent the entire day poring over them, my obsession with the valley replaced by a frantic archaeological dig through the past. Most entries were mundane, a litany of weather reports, animal sightings, and quiet contemplations on solitude. But as I got into the logs from the 70s and 80s, I started to find them. Small, cryptic notes buried amongst the official entries. From a lookout named Peterson, 1978, strange echo in the Northeast Valley tonight. Almost sounds like a song. Wind must be doing funny things. From a woman named Sarah, 1985, saw some folks down by the old mission ruins. Must be campers, but they don't have a fire, just standing there. Been there for hours. Weird. From a man named Miller, 1992, the locals in town have stories about this place. Call the ones in the valley the silent folk. Say they watch the mountain. Old folklore, I guess. Each entry was a small jolt, a piece of a puzzle I couldn't yet see. I was not the first. I flipped through the pages faster, my heart racing. The entries became more frequent in the newer books. Mentions of a tolling for the trees, a valley's hum, a feeling of being watched by the forest itself. They were all dismissed as imagination, as the strange byproducts of profound isolation. But they were there. It was a pattern, a secret history whispered between the lines of official reports. Finally, I found the most recent logbook. It belonged to Frank, my immediate predecessor, the one who had left 3 weeks early. His first few weeks of entries were normal, cheerful even. He wrote about the spectacular sunsets and the satisfaction of the job. Then his tone began to change. August 4th, heard the oddest thing during that thunderstorm last night. Sounded for all the world like a big bell. Must be losing my marbles. August 10th, I swear I can see people at the edge of the tree line down by the mission. Just watching. Every time I look, they're gone. The solitude is definitely getting to me. August 16th, it rang again last night. No storm, just rang. Over and over. This isn't the wind, this is not in my head. Someone is down there. His handwriting, once neat and precise, grew sloppy, frantic. The final pages were a desperate scrawl. August 20th, they don't hide anymore. I see them every day. They just stand there, they don't move, they just watch the tower. Sometimes I think they're praying. What do they want? August 21st, the bell. It's not a warning. I know what it is now. It's a call. It's calling me down. It wants me to leave the tower. It wants me to come into the woods. The final entry dated August 22nd was barely a sentence, scrawled across the page with such force that the pen had torn the paper. It wants me to leave. I'm leaving. A cold sweat trickled down my spine. This was it. This was my proof. I wasn't going crazy. The fear that had been gnawing at me was real, and it had a name, or at least a shape. Frank had seen them, heard them, and they had broken him. They had driven him from this tower. My hands were shaking as I picked up the binoculars. I no longer felt like I was searching for a phantom. I was looking for a known threat. I walked to the northeast window, the one that faced the Valley of Saint, Jude's mission, and raised the lenses to my eyes. I didn't have to search this time. I knew where to look, at the edge of the clearing where the dark, ancient forest began. And there they were. It wasn't just one. It was 4 of them. They were standing in a line, just inside the shadow of the first line of trees. They were tall and gaunt, draped in what looked like pale, earth-toned rags or crude deerskin cloaks. Their faces were indistinct at this distance, pale smudges in the gloom. They weren't moving. They weren't talking. They were just standing there, their bodies perfectly still, their heads tilted slightly upward. All 4 of them were staring directly at my tower. directly at me. The air in my lungs turned to ice. They knew I was watching them. They had been waiting for me to look. The logbook fell from my numb fingers and landed with a soft thud on the floor. They weren't poachers. They weren't campers. They were a silent, patient congregation, and I was the subject of their sermon. And as I stood there frozen, a tiny, terrified specimen under their collective gaze, I knew one thing with absolute soul-shattering certainty. They wanted me to leave, and they weren't going to ask again. Of course. The siege begins now. The sanctuary of the sky will become a cage. My world shrank to the 14 by 14-foot cab and the 4 silent figures standing at the edge of the woods. Time seemed to warp and stretch. Minutes felt like hours as I stood glued to the window, binoculars in hand, locked in a one-sided staring contest. They remained utterly, unnervingly still. They were like statues carved from shadow and bone, a permanent fixture of the landscape I had somehow failed to notice until now. I tried to find details that would make them human. I focused the binoculars until my eyes ached, searching for the glint of a belt buckle, the pattern of a shirt, anything to ground them in my reality. But there was nothing. Their rags seemed to absorb the light, and their faces remained frustratingly indistinct, like portraits worn smooth by time. Their stillness was the most terrifying part. It was an act of supreme patience, a predator's stillness, confident that its prey had nowhere to run. The forest behind them was a wall of impenetrable darkness. The valley they guarded was their territory, and I was an intruder, a trespasser in a glass house, exposed from every angle. The sun began its slow descent, painting the western sky in fiery strokes of orange and crimson. The beautiful, lonely spectacle I had come to cherish now felt like a taunt, a reminder that another night was coming. As the shadows in the valley deepened and climbed the mountainside, the figures began to stir. But they didn't walk away. They didn't turn or wave or acknowledge the coming darkness. Instead, they receded. It was the only word I could think of for it. One by one, they stepped backwards, melting into the encroaching gloom of the forest with an unnatural fluidity, as if the shadows were reaching out to reclaim them. Within seconds, they were gone. The tree line was just a tree line again, but it felt different now. It felt like a curtain that had been drawn on a terrible stage, and I was left alone with the knowledge of what was waiting behind it. That night, sleep was not an option. Every creak of the tower was them on the stairs. Every sigh of the wind was a whisper at the glass. I did the only thing I could think of to feel even a sliver of control. I dragged the heavy oak desk away from the wall and wedged it over the trapdoor in the floor. It was a pathetic, foolish gesture. If they could climb 100 feet of exposed steel, a desk wouldn't stop them. But it made the cab feel less like a box with 5 entrances and more like one with 4. I sat on my cot with my back against the wall, a heavy cast-iron skillet from the kitchenette resting on my lap. It was my only weapon. My mind raced through scenarios, each more terrifying than the last. Should I try to make a run for it? The thought of descending that long skeletal staircase into the pitch blackness into their woods was paralyzing. Frank's words echoed in my head. It's a call. It wants me to come into the woods. They didn't have to chase me if they could lure me out. Should I use the radio? I could declare an emergency, but what would I say? There are spooky people in the woods who stare at me. They'd think I'd gone crazy, just like Frank. This fog was different. It was purposeful. It clung to the valley floor, swallowing the trees whole, its tendrils creeping relentlessly up the mountainside towards me. I watched its silent, inexorable advance with a growing sense of dread. The fog was a blindfold. My one advantage in this tower, my ability to see for miles in every direction, was being systematically taken away from me. It was another move in their silent, terrifying game. They were blinding the eye in the sky. By noon, the world outside my windows had ceased to exist. I was floating in a sea of white, a disorienting, featureless void. There was no sky, no ground, no horizon, just the gray floor of the cab and the swirling, opaque mist that pressed against the glass. The silence was profound, deeper than any I had yet experienced. The fog seemed to swallow sound itself, muffling the wind until all that was left was the frantic, panicked beat of my own heart. I felt utterly severed from the world. And then, through the suffocating silence, the sound came again. It started with the low, mournful toll of the great bell from the valley. Its voice was different in the fog, distorted and muffled, the sound waves struggling to travel through the thick, wet air. It sounded wrong, like a memory of a sound rather than the sound itself. It was the anchor, the deep, resonant heartbeat of the nightmare. But then a new sound joined it. It was a sharp, discordant jangling. A smaller bell, a handbell, and it was close. So close, it sounded like it was coming from just below the cab. Another jangle answered it from the other side, then another, and another. Soon, a chaotic, maddening symphony of small, clanking bells surrounded me, their tones sharp and piercing, a stark contrast to the deep boom from the valley. They were not in rhythm. They were not in tune. It was a cacophony designed to grate on the nerves, to shred sanity. They were circling. I scrambled around the cab, peering uselessly into the white void, my hands pressed against the cold glass. The sound was everywhere and nowhere at once. A small bell would ring out to my left, then be answered by another to my right. A frantic, tinny clang would erupt from directly below, followed by a slower, more deliberate chime from behind me. They were at the base of the tower. They had come up the mountain under the cover of their fog. The psychological torment was immense. Blinded and besieged by a disorienting chorus of invisible tormentors, my mind began to break. Was this real? Or had I finally, completely lost my mind? The line between the tangible and the hallucinatory blurred into the white nothingness outside. I paced the small room like a caged animal, my hands over my ears, but I couldn't block out the sound. It seeped through my fingers, through the floorboards, through my very bones. Hours passed. The fog did not break. The bells did not stop. The large, booming toll from the valley continued its slow, steady rhythm, while the smaller bells danced around it in a maddening, chaotic frenzy. My mind, deprived of all visual input, started to create its own horrors. I saw shapes in the swirling mist, gaunt faces with empty eyes, long, pale hands reaching for the glass. I could hear Chloe's voice in the ringing, her screams from the fire twisted into the metallic clang of the bells. The guilt, the grief, the terror, it all swirled together into a single, overwhelming vortex of madness. I was huddled in a corner, my body trembling uncontrollably, when a sudden gust of wind hit the tower. It was stronger than before, a physical blow that made the whole structure shudder. For a single, heart-stopping moment, the fog directly below the cab was ripped apart. The white curtain was torn open, granting me a brief, horrifying window to the ground 100 feet below. My eyes shot downwards, desperate for a glimpse of reality, and I found it. They were there, all 4 of them, and more. There were 6 of them now. They stood in a perfect circle around the concrete footings of the tower. They were not looking up at me. Their heads were bowed, their bodies swaying slightly as if in a trance. Their pale rags billowed in the sudden wind, and in each of their hands they held a bell. They were small and rust-covered, the kind of old, worn handbells you might find in a country schoolhouse or a monastery. As I watched, paralyzed with horror, one of them raised its arm and shook the bell with a slow, deliberate motion. A single, discordant clang rose up to meet me. Then another raised its arm, and another. They were the source. They were the symphony. They weren't trying to get in. They weren't climbing the stairs. They were performing a ritual, a ceremony. And I was the centerpiece of it, the unwilling audience, the sacrifice on the altar. The wind died down as quickly as it had come, and the fog swirled back in, sealing the vision away. The white void returned, but the image was burned onto the inside of my eyelids, the circle of silent, swaying figures, the rusted bells, the bowed heads. The truth was infinitely more terrifying than my hallucinations. This wasn't a random haunting. It was organized. It was methodical. It was a siege on my sanity. I scrambled backwards until my back hit the far wall, a thin, wheezing scream escaping my lungs. I was trapped. 100 feet in the air, blind and alone, with a silent, unknown cult performing some unspeakable rite directly beneath me. The bells continued their maddening chorus, but I understood now. They weren't just trying to drive me out anymore. The sound wasn't a warning, it was an invocation, a summoning. And I had no idea what they were summoning, but as the deep boom from the valley echoed through the fog one more time, I knew with a chilling, absolute certainty that it was for me. The question was no longer what they wanted. It was what they were waiting for. Time ceased to have meaning. There was only the fog, the bells, and the shrinking confines of my own skull. I retreated to the furthest corner of the cab, pulling the thin mattress from the cot and propping it against the glass as a pathetic shield against the sightless void. It did nothing to stop the sound. The discordant, chaotic ringing of the handbells was a constant assault, 1,000 tiny hammers chipping away at the foundations of my sanity. Beneath it all, the deep, resonant bong from the valley continued its inexorable, funereal rhythm, the conductor of this orchestra of madness. My mind, starved of sensory input and battered by the relentless noise, began to revolt. It started feeding on itself, dredging up the one memory I had come here to escape. The phantom smell of wood smoke, as acrid and oily, began to fill the cab, so thick I could almost taste it. I knew it wasn't real. The air outside was cold and damp with fog, but the scent was undeniable, a ghost on the airwaves. Then the sounds began to merge. The high, frantic clanging of the handbells started to sound like an old-fashioned fire alarm, shrill and insistent, and in their ringing I began to hear a voice, Chloe's voice. Not her laugh, not her words, but her screams. Twisted and metallic, her final, terrified cries were woven into the cacophony, a personal layer of hell laid over the auditory torment. "Alex, help me!" The cry was so clear, so real, I lunged from my corner, my eyes scanning the featureless white outside the windows. "Chloe?" I whispered, my voice cracking. Bong! The deep toll from the valley shook the tower, and in its vibrating echo, the world outside the glass shimmered. For a heart-stopping second, the fog transformed into a wall of roiling black smoke, and through it, I saw her face. Pressed against the glass, her eyes wide with terror, her mouth open in a silent scream that perfectly matched the tolling of the great bell. It was an image ripped directly from my deepest, most guilt-ridden nightmares. I screamed and scrambled back, tripping over the leg of the desk and crashing to the floor. I squeezed my eyes shut, but the after-image was burned onto my retinas. Her face, the smoke, the fire. It was all here, in this tower. The perch I had chosen for my penance had become a perfect, customized recreation of my own personal hell. They weren't just making noise. They were listening to the sounds inside my head and playing them back to me. I lay on the floor, curled into a fetal position, my hands clamped over my ears, but it was no use. The sound was inside me now. The ringing was the frantic pulse in my veins. The deep toll was the heavy, guilty beat of my own heart. I was coming apart. The tower was no longer a refuge. It was an amplifier, a resonance chamber for my own fracturing mind. How long I stayed like that, I don't know. The sun must have set because the white of the fog eventually faded to a soft gray, then to a deep, impenetrable black. The ringing continued, unabated, a constant, maddening presence in the dark. I was losing the fight. A strange, exhausted lethargy began to creep over me. A part of my mind, the part that was exhausted of fighting, of feeling guilty, of being afraid, began to whisper to me. Frank was right. It's a call. It wants you to come down. Maybe it would be better in the woods, quiet, peaceful. Chloe is out there. She's waiting for you. The thought was seductive. To simply open the trapdoor, descend the stairs, and walk into the quiet embrace of the forest. To leave the noise and the guilt behind. To answer the call. It was this terrifying, alluring thought that shocked me back into a moment of clarity. This was how they won. This was how they broke Frank. They weren't just making noise, they were making promises. With a surge of adrenaline born of pure terror, I pushed myself up. I couldn't succumb. I wouldn't. I needed a distraction, an anchor, anything to tether my mind to reality. My eyes scanned the dark room, illuminated only by the faint green glow of the radio's display. The logbooks. There had to be more. Some other clue. I crawled across the floor, my movements clumsy and disjointed. I had searched the footlocker, but what if there was something else? Something hidden? I ran my hands along the wooden walls, the floorboards, searching for anything out of place. My fingers brushed against a section of the floor beneath where the cot usually sat. One of the planks felt slightly loose. I dug my nails into the seam, pulling and prying with frantic energy until, with a splintering groan, the board came free. Beneath it was a small, dark cavity. The air that rose from it was stale and smelled of mildew and decay. Reaching inside, my fingers closed around a small oilskin-wrapped package. I dragged it out and tore away the rotting fabric. It was another book. A small, simple diary, its black leather cover warped and stiff with age. There was no name on it, only a year, written in faded gold leaf, 1968. I scrambled to light the propane lantern, its hiss and flare pushing back the oppressive darkness. The handwriting inside was small and neat, a precise, almost scientific script that was a stark contrast to the terror the words contained. The lookout's name was Arthur Vance, a retired botanist. He described the first few weeks with an academic's curiosity, noting the strange acoustics of the valley. He too heard the bell. He too saw the figures. But he hadn't fled. He had studied them. His entries, stripped of Frank's panic, were somehow more chilling. October 12th. They are not human in the way we understand it. I do not believe them to be spirits, but rather a kind of human offshoot that has become as much a part of this forest as the ancient pines. They are symbiotic with it. I have taken to calling them the tenders, for they seem to be the mountain's caretakers. October 15th. I have come to understand their purpose. The tower is an affront to them, a wound, a sky thorn, as I found the term in an old local text. It is an eye of man that watches their sacred places, and they cannot abide it. Their ritual is not one of aggression, but of cleansing. I flipped the page, my breath catching in my throat. The neat script detailed the entire process, the initial observation, the warning toll of the great bell, and then the siege. October 20th, the fog is their shield, and the sound is their tool. I have been listening for 2 days now. It is a complex psychoacoustic assault. The deep toll from the valley song as I call it, seems to resonate at a frequency that induces a state of profound dread and sorrow. The smaller handbells create a chaotic auditory field that disrupts cognitive function and promotes paranoia. They are, in essence, trying to unmoor the occupant's mind from its anchor of reason. I read the final page, my blood turning to ice water in my veins as Arthur Vance laid bare the terrible, elegant simplicity of their plan. October 22nd, I finally understand what they want. It is the most terrifying revelation of all. They are not trying to scare me away. They are trying to break me. The logbooks of those who fled are mistaken. The sound is not a threat. It is an invitation. They believe that if they can sever a man's sanity, if they can dissolve his spirit in the crucible of their song, he will no longer belong to his own world. He will belong to them, to the mountain. They do not need to storm the tower or break down the door. They wait for you to open it yourself. They wait for you to accept their invitation to descend, leave the world of men behind, and join the silent choir in the woods. The final stage of the ritual, I suspect, is silence. They will offer their invitation, and then they will wait quietly for an answer. As my eyes read the final word, it happened. The bells stopped. All of them. All at once. The deep boom from the valley cut off mid-reverberation. The chaotic clanging of the handbells ceased in an instant. The abrupt, total silence was a physical blow, a concussive wave that left my ears ringing in the vacuum. I sat there, frozen in the lantern light, the old diary open in my lap. The silence was not peaceful. It was heavy, expectant, and profound. It was the silence of a predator that has stopped its stalking and is now coiled, waiting for its prey to make the final fatal move. The fog remained, a thick white shroud still pressed against the glass. They were down there, all of them, standing in their circle in the sightless mist, waiting. The journal was right. The invitation had been delivered. And now, in the crushing, absolute silence of the Devil's Perch, they were waiting for my answer. The silence was a physical presence. It filled the cab, pressing in on me, heavier and more suffocating than the fog or the sound that had preceded it. In the quiet, every tiny noise was magnified into a gunshot. The frantic thumping of my own heart, the whisper of my breath, the rustle of my clothes against the floor. I sat with Arthur Vance's diary in my lap, the lantern casting a small, lonely circle of light in the vast, silent darkness. The invitation had been extended. Now they were waiting. I spent the night in that silent standoff, caught between the instinct to flee and the paralyzing fear of what waited below. The words in the diary looped in my mind. They wait for you to open it yourself. My prison was of my own making. The door wasn't locked. They were giving me the illusion of choice, the most refined and cruel form of psychological torture. To stay was to slowly surrender to madness in this box. To leave was to accept their invitation. Dawn did not break. It seeped into the world. The impenetrable black of the fog softened to a charcoal gray, then to a ghostly, luminous white. Through the swirling mist, I began to see shapes again, the vague outlines of the nearest treetops, the ghostly skeleton of the catwalk beneath my feet. The world was slowly returning, but it was a changed world, a place of shifting shadows and half-truths. A gnawing thirst clawed at my throat. I stumbled to my small water canister and filled a cup. As I brought it to my lips, I caught the scent, a faint, earthy smell like damp soil and decay. I took a hesitant sip. It tasted of rust and wet leaves. My blood ran cold. They hadn't just besieged me with sound, they had been inside the tower, or at least on the catwalk where the water collection barrel was. They had been here, right beneath my feet, tainting my supplies, patiently ensuring that staying was not an option. That was the final push. There was no choice. There was only survival. My fear, which had been a paralyzing agent, now crystallized into a cold, sharp shard of adrenaline. I would not answer their call. I would not walk into their woods. I would run. I would get back to the gravel road if it was the last thing I ever did. My preparations were frantic and crude. My weapon remained the heavy, cast-iron skillet. For a shield of sorts, I strapped Arthur's thick leather-bound diary to my left forearm with strips of duct tape. It was a pathetic defense, but it was something. It felt like I was arming myself with the knowledge of what I was facing. I took a deep, shuddering breath and wrenched the desk away from the trapdoor. The scraping sound was an obscenity in the profound silence. My heart hammered against my ribs, certain that the noise would act as a signal. With my hand on the metal ring, I hesitated one last time, then pulled the heavy door open. The cold, damp air of the outside world rushed in. I swung my legs over the edge and planted my feet on the first metal grate of the staircase. The descent was the longest journey of my life. 133 steps into a white, silent abyss. My knuckles were white where I gripped the freezing handrail. My skillet, clutched in my other hand, felt impossibly heavy. The fog swirled around me, sometimes so thick I couldn't see the step below my own feet, other times thinning to reveal a terrifying, dizzying view of the misty ground far below. I could feel their eyes on me. I couldn't see them, but I knew they were there, watching my descent, patient as stone. They didn't rush me. They let me come to them. My boots finally hit the solid, damp earth at the base of the tower. I stood for a moment, disoriented, my body trembling from the adrenaline and the 100-foot climb down. The air was thick with the smell of wet pine and decay. The fog was thinner here, visibility stretching to perhaps 50 or 60 feet in any direction. The base of the tower was empty. The circle of tenders was gone. For a wild, hopeful second, I thought I might have been wrong. Maybe they had left. Then a sound broke the silence. It was not a bell. It was a single sharp snap of a twig coming from the direction of the trailhead. My head snapped towards the sound. There, standing at the edge of the fog, was one of them. A tall, gaunt figure in pale rags, its head tilted in silent observation. I didn't hesitate. I turned and ran, plunging into the woods in the opposite direction, away from the trail, hoping to circle around. The forest floor was a treacherous carpet of slick roots and moss-covered rocks. Branches whipped at my face, tearing at my clothes. I ran with the wild, panicked energy of a cornered animal. After 100 yards, I risked a glance over my shoulder. No one was following. A flicker of hope ignited in my chest. Maybe I could outrun them. I pushed harder, my lungs burning, and burst through a thicket of ferns into a small, misty clearing, and froze. Standing on the other side of the clearing, silent and waiting, was another one. It hadn't run to cut me off. It had simply been there, as if it had risen from the earth itself. A single, discordant clang rang out from the woods to my left. My head jerked towards the sound. The figure in the clearing didn't move. It was a signal. They were hurting me. I veered hard to the right, scrambling up a steep, muddy embankment. My feet slipped, my hands clawed at the dirt, pulling myself up. The memory of the map flashed in my mind. They weren't just hurting me randomly. They were pushing me northeast, towards the ruins of the mission. They were taking me home. No, I gasped, the word a ragged puff of air. No. I would not go to their church. I changed direction again, fighting my way back towards the west, towards the trail, towards the steep drop-off that was my only desperate, insane hope of escape. The bells started then, not the chaotic symphony from the night before, but single tactical tolls. A clang to my right, forcing me left. A sharp ring from behind me, driving me forward. They were shepherds and I was their lost sheep. I ran, stumbling, falling, and getting back up, my body screaming in protest. I burst through another line of trees, and one was right there, not 10 feet away, blocking my path. I finally saw one up close. The sight stopped my heart. The rags were the color of old bone and fungus. The skin beneath was pale and tight, almost translucent, stretched over a gaunt, elongated frame. Its face was vaguely human, but ancient and devoid of all emotion. The eyes were the worst part. They were wide and dark, like pools of stagnant water, and they held a profound, horrifying emptiness. There was no anger, no malice. There was only a calm, patient certainty. It raised a hand, not to attack, but as if in greeting. In its long, pale fingers, it held a small, rusted handbell. The sight broke my paralysis. With a raw, guttural scream, I charged, swinging the cast iron skillet like a club. I didn't aim for its head, but for the bell. The skillet connected with a sickening, metallic crunch. The figure didn't cry out, but it recoiled, its empty eyes widening almost in surprise. The bell flew from its grasp. That was my chance. I pushed past it, not daring to look back, and sprinted with the last of my strength. I could hear the bells behind me now, faster, more insistent, their patient rhythm broken. I had broken the rules of their game. The trees began to thin. I could see the faint outline of the gravel road through the mist. The trailhead. I was almost there. I burst from the forest onto the rocky clearing where Howard had left me an eternity ago. The steep, 1,000-foot drop was just ahead. I didn't slow down. I ran to the edge and without a second thought launched myself over the side, grabbing and sliding down the near vertical cliff face of loose rock and scree. Rocks tore at my clothes and skin. My hands were raw and bleeding as I clawed at roots and boulders to slow my descent. I fell the last 20 feet, landing in a painful, jarring heap in a thicket of thorny bushes. For a moment, I lay there, broken and gasping, the world spinning. Then I heard it. From the top of the cliff, a final, sorrowful toll of a single bell. It was not a sound of anger, it was a sound of farewell. Then, silence. I don't know how long I stumbled down that mountain road. Hours, maybe a whole day. I was found by a pair of hikers near the main park entrance, a bloody, mud-caked, raving creature. They said I was suffering from severe dehydration and exposure. They said I kept screaming about a bell. I am safe now, physically. I'm in a clean, quiet room with soft lighting and a window that looks out onto a manicured lawn. My parents are here. They talk in hushed, worried tones. A doctor comes in and asks me questions I can't answer. They tell me I've been through a traumatic ordeal, that the mind can play tricks on you in extreme isolation. They tell me I'm lucky to be alive. I know they are wrong. I am not lucky. I am not safe. I escaped, but I did not get away. Because every night, when the world grows quiet and the silence deepens, I hear it. It's faint, a barely there echo on the edge of hearing, but it's there. The deep, mournful toll of a single, distant bell. And sometimes when I look out the window, past the neat lawn and the civilized streetlights, into the dark patch of woods at the edge of the property, I see a tall, pale figure standing there, just inside the tree line, watching, waiting. The invitation has been extended, and they are very, very patient. They know that one day I might just answer.